about different types of grants, different types of grant funders, where to find grants, how to research the funders, and we're going to learn about the elements of the grant proposal, how to prepare for and plan and write a grant proposal. But primarily, we're going to focus on the process. And so with that, we'll go get started. And like Kevin said, I'm going to pause every now and then for questions. So, feel free to think about your questions and ask them then, or write them in the chat box, or however you want to do it. And we'll have some time for interaction and go from there. So a little bit more about myself. I am from Providence St. Joseph Health, the Corporate Foundation Relations Officer for the Southern California region, and I'm part of a grants team where we cover the Southern California hospitals. So I primarily focus on grants for St. Jude and Fullerton, St. Joseph and Orange, Mission Hospital and Mission Viejo. We also have St. Mary and Apple Valley, and we have several LA County hospitals too. So I'm part of a team. I actually just started with Providence back in November, so I'm pretty new with Providence. Before that, I worked with Verity Health System, and I was the regional grants director for St. Francis Medical Center in Linwood, as well as St. Vincent Medical Center in downtown LA. And I was there since 2012, started at St. Francis. And we had several different types of grant clients that I prepared proposals for and managed grants for, including the state of California, LA County Department of Public Health, the state of California had covered California, California Victim Compensation Board, First 5 LA, Carrie Estelle Doheny Foundation, we had Annenberg Foundation, Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, California Community Foundation, LA Care. That's just a few of the funders that we worked with. And over the 7 years that I was there, we had over 290 submittals, I believe, with over 62 million roughly in asks and over 33 million in awards. And before that, I worked for 18 years for an environmental engineering company as a public outreach manager. And my work there, I either contributed to or prepared hundreds of different contract proposals. And those resulted in a value of over roughly 50 million in awards. So that's a kind of a quick background of myself. So as you know, there are several aspects to a nonprofit's organizational income. You have individual donors, special events, which are maybe virtual right now, plan giving, and of course, grants. And I wanted to show you a chart about contributions. So in 2018, Americans gave over 427 billion to charity, according to Giving USA. And in 2019, that amount grew to almost 450 billion. And 75 billion of that was given by foundations. So that's probably a lot of where the grants came from. And of the overall 450 billion, 64 billion went to education, 56 billion went to human services, 41 billion went to healthcare, and so on. So just goes to show you there's a lot of money out there, but the trick is where to find it and how to get it, right? So types of grants. Wanted to go over quickly types of grants. There's a lot of different types of grants out there, and does anyone want to just shout out or list what type of grants that you're aware of? Just
corporate grants?
Corporate, sure.
We also have like private funders that want to do something with the grant and they want proposals.
Sure.
I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but there are restrictive and general operating grants.
Yes, exactly, right. Yep. So those are just a couple of couple of them. So in general, the most common seem to be program grants that are directed towards a specific program. There's capital grants that go towards equipment or construction, something like that. There's research grants, if you're into research, like a university or one of those types of firms. And there's the Holy Grail is kind of the general operating support or unrestricted grants, and those seem to have kind of been few and far between or harder to get. But if you can get them, obviously those are the best type of grants to get. And there's also something called discretionary grants. So those are most often unadvertised grants that, say, for example, a foundation's board might give each board member a certain amount of money to give out in grants as they see fit. So those are something that you would want to ask about. But here's a list of different types of grants. So I wanted to give you a few real life examples of grants that Providence has gotten over the past year and a half or so, year or two. Capital grants, we've received a couple of capital grants, In particular, we had a $118,000 grant from the Will Rogers Institute for upgrades to the NICU at one of our hospitals, the neonatal intensive care unit. We also received $100,000 from the Henry L. Gunther Foundation. They're in the LA County. That went towards the purchase of a linear accelerator for one of the hospitals. For some of our recent program grants, we had received $50,000 from Covered California for the Navigator program to help people sign up for health insurance. And over at St. Joseph, we received funding from the Healthcare Foundation for Orange County for a perinatal depression program that's been going on for several years. It's been very successful. We have received a few operations grants, including $15,000 recently from the Allergan Foundation for general operations / COVID-19 response, and a smaller grant from the Gray Blanket Foundation about last year. But anyway, quick note on the Allergan Foundation. Allergan was recently acquired by the AbbVie organization, so Allergan is not giving out grants at the moment, it looks like. So they're going to be combining their foundation, I believe, with AbbVie. But AbbVie is another foundation that we've worked with in the past here at Providence as well. So just real quick, is any questions so far about types of grants before we move forward? Okay, very good. So next we are going to move on to types of funders. So, we mentioned a couple of types of funders already, but there's, various types of funders out there. Government funders, obviously, you have the federal grants that come with a lot of money a lot of the time. State grants, state of California gives out a lot of grants. You can get grants from the county. County of Orange gives out grants. LA County, we had one in my previous work, we had a lot of grants and contracts from LA County Department of Public Health, as I mentioned. And cities, you can get grants from cities also, primarily through the Community Development Block Grants, CDBGs. We've had those in the past, and if you're familiar with those, the RFPs for those usually come out yearly at the beginning of the year. Usually the funding is really limited, and sometimes they're hard to get for the first time, but once you get a grant, a CDBG grant from a city the first time, it's easier to get additional grants from them. But check with your local cities, and not necessarily just the ones where you're located, but cities where you might provide service, and you could look into those usually at the beginning of the year, and the funding for those are on a year-to-year basis. They usually go July 1st through June 30th. And I must warn you also, they come with a lot of accounting and a lot of procedures that go with it. So it's usually, CDBG grants are usually a lot of work for a little bit of money. So foundations come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and structures. You have smaller family foundations, you have the larger community foundations, you have large, sophisticated private foundations, and of course you have corporate foundations. And speaking of foundations, we talked about the different types of foundations. Family foundations, where the funds usually come from a single source, and as you may know, they're required to make at least a 5% distribution every year from their funds. And typical of any foundation, their funding preferences usually reflect the founder's preferences. And so in that respect, they act a lot like individual donor prospects. But just a couple examples of family foundations locally are the Ubroth Family Foundation, K Family Foundation, Samueli Family Foundation, and many, many others. And corporate foundations obviously are dominated by their owners, and they mirror their company priorities, and they usually they prefer opportunities that benefit themselves. So they're usually looking for something that'll help them out or give them good publicity. And so examples of corporate foundations, as we had heard before, there's the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, Edwards Life Sciences Foundation, Mazda Foundation, Wells Fargo is a good one, and they have a lot of other foundations that they work with. So that's a good one to look into. PIMCO, Union Bank, and the list goes on and on. So I wanted to stop there and just talk a little bit about the corporate foundation. So there's other ways to get funding through corporations. So they have a lot of corporations have foundations, but they also have corporate giving separate. So that's one thing you'll want to check when you're researching corporate foundations or corporate funders is how they give the money and through what channels, and some may have multiple channels. So wanted to give you an example from my previous experience when I was working with St. Vincent Medical Center in downtown LA. They had a program called the Asian Pacific Liver Center, and they did a lot of research and studies related to Hep C, Hep B, and along with the Asian community. So anyway, they got a lot of funding from Gilead, primarily for studies. So as you may or may not know, St. Vincent was going through a lot of changes, and that when I was there, it was a nonprofit, and we thought they were going to be moving to a for-profit structure. So I was contacting Gilead to find out how that they could fund this program if we moved to a for-profit structure. So anyway, what I found out is Gilead is one of these corporations that they have a lot of different funding arms. So they did have a foundation. So the foundation would only give funds to nonprofit organizations, but their research arm could give out funding to any organization, for profit or nonprofit. In addition to that, I found out they also have an education arm that gives out funding. So, and I think they even had another arm that gave out funding. So that Gilead, for example, 3 or 4 different arms of funding. So bottom line is be aware of different areas of funding for corporations. So to continue on with different types of foundations, community foundations are usually large. They're designed to pool donations from throughout the community into a coordinated investment and grant-making organization. So obviously you have the Orange County Community Foundation. Now they do give out some grants, so they coordinate grants from some of their donors. A lot of their funding comes through donor advised funds. So you'll definitely want to meet with the Orange County Community Foundation and learn more about them. In LA, they have the California Community Foundation. They fund mainly in LA County. Up north there, you might have heard the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which is, I think, one of the biggest foundations out there. They have tons of funding. And then obviously you have private foundations that fund in every segment of the nonprofit sector. Usually they're large entities. They can make significant gifts. They usually have a large staff that are interested in solutions to society's most pressing needs. So different types of private foundations. You have UniHealth Foundation, Weingart Foundation, California Wellness Foundation that, they provide all different types of grants. Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, Annenberg Foundation, and the list goes on and on. And just wanted to pause there also to see if anyone wanted to mention any other funders in particular that they've worked with in the past that you may want to mention or discuss.
We've worked with the Swenson Family Foundation a lot, and they're obviously they love the ocean. They live in Dana Point, so they do that. We also received a $100,000 grant from Boeing to develop programming that was related to, we called it Engineers Wanted, but it was related to like water quality, water conservation, and they built solar cars and they did a bunch of different things. So Boeing gave us money to develop it, but it also gave us money to like pilot it. So they're out there.
Great, that's good to hear, definitely. Any others?
Tim, Molly had a question. If you had any suggestions on searchable foundation or grant databases. That might be covered later, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good question. And we will come to that in a moment. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. We'll cover that.
Can I chime in for just a second?
Sure.
One of the best ways that I have actually found which foundations and or grants will fund like-minded work, because of course that is an important thing to look at, is to look at what other like-minded organizations are doing, right? Look at their annual reports, look at their newsletters, and follow them on social media. And of course, to support them as well. I'm not saying that being a total poacher is a great idea, but it is helpful to help get leads, right? On especially what your specific mission is.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a good segue. We have some of those points coming up as well, definitely. Thank you.
Sure, sorry about that.
No, very good. That's what we're here for. Interactive. Okay, so speaking of grant opportunities, there are numerous ways to find grant opportunities, and obviously we've already talked about a couple just ways to find it, but talking about databases and, well, not databases, but websites so far. Grants.gov is the go-to for federal opportunities. So you'll want to go to grants.gov and you can sign up for searchable emails that'll come to you. Well, you'll sign up for your preferences, I should say. So sign up for your preferences and grants.gov will email you grant opportunities as they come up with your preferences. So for me, obviously, I went in there and did health preferences. And so I get emails from grants.gov just about every day from all different kinds of health RFPs that come out. Bidsync.com is what the County of Orange uses for their bids. So you want to go into their Bidsync, and it's similar to grants.gov, but for Orange County, and that covers more than just Orange County in BidSync's database. So you might want to try to get your preferences honed in as well as best as you can. I get emails from them mainly from Orange County, but I actually still get stuff from out of state from them, and I haven't been able to fine tune it yet to just get the Orange County ones. A real good one is PND by Candid. That stands for Philanthropy News Digest. And so that's another e-newsletter to go to and sign up for that. So e-newsletters, funder websites, signing up for newsletters from funder websites, that's a must if you want to find grant opportunities, because through email, newsletters, and emails, you can get dozens of grant opportunities, almost more than you can handle. So usually in my inbox every morning, I have about 5 different email newsletters from grants.gov and the other ones, and I'm sure it could be many more if I wanted to, but that kind of gives me a good overview of RFPs that come out. So other ways to find grant opportunities is through your coworkers. Once your coworkers know that you're looking for grants, a lot of times they'll come to you, and either they'll find grant opportunities and usually forward them over to you and say, hey, I got this grant opportunity emailed to me, or I heard about it from someone else. Can you check it out for me? And sometimes there'll be great opportunities, and sometimes they'll be way off the mark, but that's usually a good source. Board members, you'll want to let your board members know that you're out there looking for grants and what type of grants you're looking for, what programs you're looking for funding. So a lot of the times your board members will get grant opportunities, or hopefully they'll have relationships with funding organizations or with corporations, so they can put you in touch with certain funders. So for example, when I was working with St. Francis Medical Center, their board chairman was a lawyer, or he was an attorney, and I was researching a particular corporate funder. It was an attorney organization, a professional organization of attorneys that gave out grants. So I contacted that particular board member of mine, and I asked him, hey, have you ever heard of this organization? And he actually looked into it for me. And for that particular one, he didn't happen to know about it. But you have other opportunities. I had another board member on that particular board who was into hotel development. His company would develop local hotels, and he had some contacts at some of the larger hotel organizations for potential funding opportunities, like the Hiltons and those types. So board members are a good source. Also, other fundraising colleagues that you have, hopefully you have contacts with other ones, other fundraising colleagues that aren't your coworkers, that outside of work, that might be able to help you with fundraising opportunities. And there's lots of other websites out there. Search for them, you'll find them. Chronicle of Philanthropy is one that I look at, and professional associations that I look at. Grant Professionals Association, GPA. There's Association for Healthcare Philanthropy. That's obviously specifically toward healthcare. It's also AFP, Association for Fundraising Professionals, which is good. It covers all kinds of fundraising, and they have a local chapter here in Orange County, and that's good organization is to be a part of, aside from just grant opportunities.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just want to give a quick pitch for AFP. We also, for 1OC, we host their monthly webinars. If you guys want to check those out, they're great recordings, and then it's a networking session. We usually do it in the office, but this past Friday, we actually did the first one virtually, and then we have a time of facilitation at the end to discuss the webinar, and you can network with other development professionals. So those are all on our website. I think they're like 10 or 15 bucks, and they're an hour and a half long. Great information. So I would definitely recommend that if you guys want to get connected. And if you have questions about AFP, I can connect you to the head of the Orange County chapter if you guys want to join.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Okay, just a little bit before you actually start. So you're going to want to know, obviously, you're going to want to know your organization's funding priorities. So that would usually come with a meeting at the beginning of your funding year with your supervisor, maybe with your CEO or your executive director or other executives, so to discuss your funding priorities for that particular year. And you want to know your programs. You want to learn what makes your program or programs effective, what makes them a best practice. So, if you can, you want to meet with your program managers and, learn as much about the program as you can ahead of time. That way, when it comes to researching funders and funding opportunities, you'll have a better chance, you'll have a better opportunity to hone in on the right ones. And once you start writing, you'll have a better shot of getting an effective proposal down. And with that, though, you also want to educate your program staff about grants. So as I had mentioned before, a lot of times you might have your program staff coming to you with grant ideas or funding opportunities, but often they might come to you with funding needs. And so, for example, I might have someone come to me and say, "Hey, Tim, we need new funding for this, certain piece of equipment." And I'll say, "Okay, great. When do you need it?" "Well, we need it right away, hopefully within the next month. Can you get a grant for it?" "Well, no, not really in the next month." So you need to let your program staff know about the grant process. The grant process, it could be months to a year from when you start looking to when you actually get the money. So that you'll need to build into your planning process and also your education process of your program staff. You also want to develop relationships with the funders, and we're going to go over that in a little more detail as well. So we talked a little bit about researching funders, and so wanted to go over some of the databases, how and where to research funders. So does anyone want to shout out or let us know about some of the databases or online sites that you use? Or if you do? Okay, well, let me just go to the slide here and talk to you about some of these. These are great resources here for researching the funders. So once you find an opportunity, you're going to want to learn more about the funder. So GuideStar is an online database that you can go to, and they're actually GuideStar, Foundation Directory Online, those, and Philanthropy News Digest. I think they've all been acquired by Candid. But anyway, GuideStar is the free database. So you can research funders, you can research funding opportunities, I believe, the different grants that have gone out. So that's a free online database that's really great. You can sign up for and use anytime. And Foundation Directory Online. Now this is a paid database, but for many grant writers, it's the go-to database. It is for me. So if you're part of an organization that can buy it, that would be great. Buy access to it, or if not, sometimes you can get free access through either libraries or from your local community foundation. So Foundation Directory Online has, you can search by a myriad of different types of things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And I'll show you an example actually from GuideStar and Foundation Directory Online. GrantStation is another one. Grantsmanship Center. Those two I think are both paid, but they both are good resources. So you might want to check those out. And OC Nonprofit Central, that's a free resource through the Orange County Community Foundation. So you can go on that and search funders, and that's another good resource. And like we mentioned, a local community foundation. So once you start researching of funders, what do you look for? Well, like we mentioned earlier, you want to review their website, review their publications, look at their annual reports, and through their website, you want to look at their areas of focus. So most of the time, the funders will have 1, 2, maybe 4 different areas which they fund. So you're going to want to look at those areas to make sure that those funding those funding preferences match up with what you're looking for, you're funding for. So you'll also want to review the funder's recent giving history. So does anyone know a good way to, well, let me step back. A lot of the funders' websites will have listing of recent grants that they've given out. Not all of them do, but if they don't have it on the website, who can tell me where another good area to find recent grants could be? Anyone? Any guesses? The 990, the Form 990. So is anyone here familiar with the Form 990s? Have you looked at 990s in the past, or anyone? So 990s are basically the nonprofits tax form. So I wanted to give you an example here. So GuideStar, as I mentioned, that's the free website. You can research funders and by name, by area, etc. So just at random, I picked out the Ubroth Family Foundation. So I'm not endorsing them or not endorsing them. Just since they're an Orange County foundation, I picked them. I personally have not had any interactions with them. I haven't had any grants from them, but I had done some research on them recently, so I thought we would include them. So when you research a funder on GuideStar, this is their profile that will come up. And this is the one for the Ubroth Foundation. So, you can see this is just the top part of their profile, but if you look on the right-hand side over here, you'll see a button that says Show Form 990s. So you want to click on that and look at 1 or 2, possibly 3 of the most recent 990s. And so I have a sample of a snippet from the Ubroth Form 990. So this is the first page of their 990. And you can see this is just some of their basic information, their assets, and this page kind of goes on, so you can go through and see their revenue and contributions, that type of thing. And then if you skip over a couple of pages to part 5, you can look at their yearly distributions for the past 5 years. So as you can see, for this particular foundation, they've been giving 2 million to 2.8 million over the past 5 years. So when you look at a funder, and if you can see that they're giving a lot of funds, you might see that this might be a good funder to look after. You might find some family foundations that have hardly any, maybe no funding. So maybe you might find that they're not functioning or they're not operational, or they're giving just a small amount. So maybe you might find that might be a funder you might want to pass on. So you look over at this column C over here, you can see their assets. So their assets over the past 5 years range from 37 to 42 million. And so, that'll go up and down with the stock market, their asset base. And so they're giving, unless they're getting outside funding from their corporation or their families, their annual giving will go up and down, with the stock market a lot of times. And you can see off to the right, their percentage. They were up to actually 7% a couple of years ago. So also on the 990, this is part 15, a few pages down, you can find some contact and submittal information. So This down here, you could see UBroth Foundation has a phone number, a name, phone number, address, and where they're, how to submit. So I've seen some 990s, this section will be blank, but let's say if you're looking at their website and you can't find any contact information, this is another source that you could go to try to find information. So if you want to contact the funder, this is one way. Now, just be careful though that with these, sometimes these are out of date, so you want to make sure that when you contact someone through this, you want to make sure that this information is up to date. So next on the 990s, we talked about how to see who they have given to, what are other organizations they've given to recently. So on this part of the form, usually it's towards the back, but they'll have a list of the organizations they gave to and the amount. So you're going to want to look through this section carefully to see if they're funding organizations that are similar to yours. So for example, for UBroth, they had given to the ALS, given to Alzheimer's, given to Big Brothers, Big Sisters, they even gave to Boston University, etc. So some of the larger foundations, like the community foundations and so forth, they'll have pages and pages of who they've given grants to. And so off to the right here, you usually see what the amounts are. So you want to take a look at that carefully also. So you can see the foundations here, they gave 20,000, 75,000. Those are some of the examples. So you're going to want to look at these also to give you a ballpark idea of how much you can ask for. So you can see how much they've given to similar organizations and how much, and you can kind of gauge your ask amount from that. So before I move on to the foundation directory online, does anyone have any questions on 990s or researching funders so far?
Tim, I just have a question, maybe related or not, but
Sure.
are there any networking groups for grant writers that could be beneficial to share information?
Yeah, definitely. So as we talked about AFP, that's a good one to join. Now that's not grant writing specific, so you can talk, that's for funders, all types of fundraisers. But there's also the Grant Professionals Association, GPA, and I actually just joined that fairly recently, and it seems to be a pretty good organization, and they have a email distribution list, so it's pretty good as active, where you can email and ask questions to other grant professionals across the country. And so I get that in digest form, so every morning I get a digest of the questions that went out the previous day. So that in particular is a good networking. And there's also, LinkedIn has grant writing groups in particular. If you're active on LinkedIn, that's another good networking opportunity. Does anyone else have any other suggestions, anything in particular, any other networking groups that they might want to suggest? Okay, no problem. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. Good question. Thank you for asking. So foundation, excuse me, Foundation Directory Online is another, like I mentioned, is another good source, and you can search, the search is powerful. So I wanted to bring up again, as the example, you search for foundations, you find the UBroth Foundation, and you come up to their profile page. So this is the top part of their profile page, where it gives a lot of information, what is being funded, where in the country it's going, how big are the grants. They have the actual grants down here that you can click on for more information. It talks about the funding interests and a little bit about their organization, type of foundation, as well as some background. And it'll usually have the application process. You can see it right here. And again, you can compare this to their website to see if this is matching with their website. It's up to date. Usually it's pretty good. A lot of this is sometimes directly off the 990s. Another good part here is other funders to consider. So it will show you similar funders. So you can click on any of these ones and go directly to these funders. So you can see a lot of some of these are up north. There's one in out of state, but that's another good source here. You're giving limitations, so you could see this particular foundation gives primarily in Orange County. But even though it says this primarily in Orange County, we saw that through GuideStar, the 990, they actually gave to Boston University. So it's more of a guideline. So that's a quick overview of Foundation Directory Online, but that's a good organization a good website to look at. So finding the perfect fit. Excuse me. So finding the perfect fit, your time is limited as a grant writer. So you're going to want to be strategic in your grant applications. Too often, we'll see an RFP that sounds good, that sounds like, hey, that sounds like something that we could do. And so we try to create a program to fit the RFP. So what I'm recommending is you want to look for RFPs that fit your existing programs. So like I said, you want to create the perfect fit, kind of like Cinderella's slipper. You want to create the perfect fit for your existing program. So also with grant applications, I wanted to talk a little bit about the targeted approach versus the shotgun approach. So it's much better to have a high win percentage with a low number of submittals versus a high amount of submittals and a low win percentage. So I wanted to kind of give an example of personal experience with that. So when I worked at St. Francis Medical Center, well, I joined in 2012, and the year prior to that, the grant writers there were directed by the existing executive director to basically to use the shotgun approach to make as many submittals as possible for that year. And so they followed directions. They sent out as many submittals as they can. I think they submitted, but the problem was with the shotgun approach, they didn't have time to properly research the funders. A lot of those submittals were rejected by not being eligible. So that year they ended up getting less than $1 million in awards compared to the year previously when they had over $3 million in awards. So the next year when I got there, they had just recently got a new executive director. So this new executive director directed us grant writers to use a targeted approach. So that year, we only made submittals to foundations that we already knew or had relationships with, or to RFPs or funders where it was the right fit for our existing program. So as a result, we only had roughly about 40 submittals that year, but we had a high win percentage and we received over $4 million in awards. So just for that one year-to-year comparison, it was a good example of targeted versus shotgun approach. And as we said, you wanted to, prior to submitting, you want to attempt cultivation, try to develop a relationship with the funders. So as we know, in fundraising in general, people give to people. And that's true in the grant writing realm as well. So wanted to talk a little bit now next about cultivation. So cultivation is making a positive contact with the funder before you begin the grant writing process. So as we mentioned, you can check with your board members or your other staff about your relationships they may have with funders. So you want to make contact with the funder and call them and ask them about the grant opportunity before you start writing. So before you make that first call to a funder, you want to be prepared and be the informed novice, so to speak. So you want to review their website and review their public materials, review their 990s, and prepare smart questions before you contact them. So the last thing funders want to do is to have to explain the process to you if it's already on their website. So you want to make sure that you let them know that you've reviewed their website, you've reviewed their materials, their 990s, etc. And then based on that, you want to have at the ready 2 or 3 programs to pitch to them. So funding opportunities that you want to get, programs that you want to get funded. So you've looked at their website, you looked at their focus areas, and you find a good fit with one of your programs. And so you want to talk to the funder about that and say, hey, we have this program we thought that you might be interested in, and talk to them about it and hopefully get them interested. And sometimes though, they'll say, no, that's not really what we're interested in, and they may give you some more direction. We're more interested in, this or that. So that's when you have your backup programs. You say, oh, well, we have this other program that you might be interested, etc. So that's one way to be prepared for your cultivation calls. And another thing that you want to do is try to find out how much to give, or how much to ask for, excuse me. So you've done your research on that. Now, typically, funders are not going to come straight out and tell you how much you can ask for. But you can kind of be strategic about that. And when you're talking about your program, and based on your research, you can say to the funder, I like to say something like, well, we're thinking about asking around X amount of dollars. Like, we're thinking about asking around $10,000 for this program. How does that sound to you? So you're not asking them to tell you directly, but oftentimes they'll respond to that, and they'll say, they might say something, oh yeah, that sounds like a right amount. Or they might say something like, oh no, for first time funders, we only give them 5,000 or something along those lines. Or, so that's a good way to, a roundabout way to asking about that. Otherwise, usually funders might they won't tell you how much to ask for. They might just say, oh, ask for how much you need for your program. Well, that's great, but you want your ask to be targeted and specific. So you don't want your ask to be astronomically higher than what they normally give, or way too low. So that's a good way to gauge your ask amount. Another thing is to make sure you ask for updates to the website. See if there's anything that's either new that hasn't been put on the website yet, or also any updates, anything old on there. Also, you want to ask them about opportunities not listed on the website. So this is where we talk about the discretionary grants, or what they're called sometimes backdoor opportunities. So say, hey, is there anything else that I need to know about, or anything that's not listed on the website, or anything update. So that's kind of a quick overview on opportunities for cultivation. And so you want to keep in contact with your funder and develop a relationship. So I want to stop there and see if there's any questions on anything we've gone over so far, or cultivation or anything else. Okay, very good. Well, moving right along here, talking about the starting point before you start writing your grant proposal. The main thing you want to do, as I have this in bold here, is obtain the guidelines and determine your eligibility. So before you start writing, before you start notifying your partners or coworkers, you want to make sure that you're eligible. So a lot of times there's a lot of fine print on eligibility. So you want to make sure you look at that carefully, and it can save you a lot of time and headache. So the last thing you want to do is start writing a proposal and then later on realizing your organization's not even eligible. So I'll show a couple of examples of that in a few minutes. So you also want to check the deadlines to make sure you're, if there's any submittal deadlines, check to see if there's, if it's an open submittal or if it's invite only. A lot of funders will have only give to selected organizations. So you have to either have to develop a relationship ahead of time and ask for, get an invite, or maybe they'll only give to previously funded grantees. So once you've determined your eligibility and checked your deadlines and everything, you want to develop your plan before you get started. So what I always do, especially on the larger proposals, is I develop a very detailed plan that includes a checklist, a timeline, and assignments. So the checklist, what I like to include is all the questions on the proposal and assign those questions to different team members. So a grant proposal, especially the larger ones, the federal ones, it has to be a team effort. So you're going to want to start from the very beginning with your checklist. Try to get a kickoff meeting at the beginning with team members that are going to be involved, and assign writing assignments to different team members, like your program manager. Especially for me, when we're writing clinical proposals, I'm actually not a clinical person, so I'm going to want my clinical people to, either write the clinical section or, give me detailed bullets where we can put it into paragraph form and then have them review it afterwards. So that's another thing, developing your plan. You want your timeline, you need to build in enough time to get reviews of your drafts, the reviews of your final. Make sure, for myself, we have to make sure we have the clinical people review it to make sure everything is accurate. So you might have similar issues at your organizations. Also, there are a lot of times there's attachments and forms that you need to fill out and get signed by your CEO or executive director. So you want to make sure you build in time and plan for getting those forms filled out correctly and getting them to the CEO, the ED, in enough time to where they can sign it and get it back to you. So often I'll like to coordinate that with the administrative assistant and get to know the ED's time schedule, so we know that we can get those signed forms back in time to get in the proposal. And you need to build time in there to get everything formatted and formatted however it needs to be, the various formats, and submit it. So teamwork is the name of the game. And
Hey, Tim.
Yes, sir.
We had a couple questions going back a little bit. Crystal asked a question. Do you put cultivation research notes in some type of database? Was the first question.
Okay, say that again.
Do you put cultivation research and notes in some type of database to keep track of all that information?
That's an excellent question, which I did not actually have on the presentation. And so yes, at my organization, we use a database format. It's called Razor's Edge. And so that's for tracking all kinds of fundraising and grants, all kinds of gifts to an organization. So in Razor's Edge, you can go in and track all your contacts with the funder. So yes, that's actually very important. It's a great question. So you want to track your cultivation with notes. And so that way you can go in and also your coworkers can go back in. So before you contact the funder, either for the first time or contacting them again, you can go back into your donor database, look at the notes and see who have talked to them in the past. And so like a big organization like myself, the Razor's Edge database, we have assignments. So different funders are assigned to different organizations. So I'll want to go in and check to see if a particular funder is assigned to anyone, if it's assigned to me or someone else. So Razor's Edge is what we use. It's pretty expensive, I believe, but there are a lot of different databases out there that you can look for. And, for example, we talked about the Grant Professional Association earlier. I've seen a lot of question threads in there about different types of databases. So one way to learn about databases is through your networking opportunities. So good question. Thank you.
One more was just any tips for a really strong letter of inquiry. Maybe we could talk about that at the end, or if you have a few quick tips we could talk about real quick.
Yes, we do. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. So hold that thought for a minute, okay? So let's talk about, I talked about eligibility and making sure about that you're eligible for an award. So I got a couple quick examples here. This is a grant opportunity from grants.gov. And I don't know if you can actually read this down here at the bottom, but they always have eligibility requirements, eligible applicants, and then often they have other additional information on eligibility. So you're going to want to read this carefully. For this particular one, it was about nurse education, and hospitals were one of the eligible organizations and or schools. So this was one that we actually applied for, and we applied as a hospital in partnership with Cal State Fullerton School of Nursing. So we were able to, before starting on this, we were able to determine our eligibility. Here's just an example from County of Orange from a recent RFP. You can see they have, for this particular one, it's I think for home services for alcohol and drug treatment, but you have to have 2 years previous experience on these services, etc. So that's another thing to read carefully. Now, here's an example of a private foundation. Now, this is the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation, and this is a private foundation that funds spinal cord injury primarily projects. So this is one where we actually have a current proposal into, but as you can see here in the second paragraph, grants are awarded only to qualifying nonprofit organizations in the US and Canada and not awarded to individuals. And it goes on. So a lot of funder websites will have something similar to this. Usually they'll just have a bulleted list of who they don't give to. They don't give to individuals, they don't give to political parties or to religious organizations specifically for religious projects, those types of things. So usually you can get a good idea from the funder's website about eligibility. So for this one, as I mentioned, you can actually, that we submitted for, you can see off to the right, possibly here, hold on a sec. I'm going to hide the video panel just so you can see this a little better. This shows their different funding focus areas. And for us, where we submitted for St. Jude, it was through creating opportunity and independence. And so I clicked on that. And then within that section, it gives you more detail about the funding categories, community support grants, and sustainable impact grants. So we actually submitted under the community support grants, and we submitted for a piece of equipment called a 0G gravity for therapy for spinal cord injured patients for our rehab center at St. Jude. So anyway, that's a quick overview of a private foundation. So wanted to go over types of submittals. So like we mentioned, someone had a question about the letter of inquiry. So foundation funders, it'll be usually one of two ways, either starting with a letter of inquiry or letter of intent, sometimes it's called, and or a proposal. So you can respond, sometimes you just respond directly to a proposal, respond directly to an RFP, or submit a proposal based on the website, or you submit a letter of inquiry, and then you get an invitation to submit a full proposal. And so as you probably know already, there are a lot of different types of submittals. Most of them nowadays seem to be online submittals. There's still some that you email your submittal in, and believe it or not, there are still some that you have to actually mail in a hard copy of a proposal. But those are getting less and less nowadays, thankfully. Up until at least a few years ago, LA County had written hard copy submittals the last time I had submitted it to them. And that was, you had to submit the original and like 6 hard copies had to be delivered by the deadline date at their office, Department of Public Health. So I don't know if they switched to online yet, but most of those days of hard copy submittals, thankfully, are gone. But anyway, online submittals, there's a lot of different types of online submittals, and I wanted to show you some examples. A lot of funders nowadays have, they use an online service. So this is the Nielsen Foundation again, and they use an outside service called Proposal Central. And so this is actually our proposal. This is a view of our proposal after the fact, but right here on the left-hand side here, you can see the different areas that you need to fill in. And I happen to click on attachments. Not sure if you could read that, but different kind of shows the different attachments that you include. And over here, as I mentioned, the different areas that you have to fill in. There's an online form. And so this one is kind of a combination of filling out an online form and making attachments. For this one, we actually did a narrative that we attached in the attachment section as a online PDF or as a PDF. So here's another, just a quick example of an online. So this is the Allen Foundation. It's a very small foundation, I believe, out in Michigan that funds specifically for nutrition education. But they have just a form, so you could see in 250 words or less, concisely describe the objectives. In 1,000 words or less, describe the objectives of the proposal. In 500 words or less, provide blah, blah, blah. So you can see here, you've probably seen these. Sometimes these can get kind of difficult. You have the online form to fill out. It says, describe your project in 500 words or less, or describe it in 3,000 characters or less. So on these online submittals, you want to, most of the times what I do is I'll start off in a Word document, and then once I fine tune the questions on the Word document and get it to the right character count or word count, then I paste it into the online form. And then usually it'll tell you if you're, if you're over the amount of words or characters, or if you're under. So when they talk characters, that usually includes spaces and apostrophes and all that other stuff. So those just a couple of things to be aware of when you're filling out an online submittal form. Going back to the County of Orange, the RFP that we looked at earlier. So this one is similar to the Nielsen Foundation, whereas you prepare documents in PDF and you upload it via the BidSync site. And hard copies are not accepted in this particular, which is good. So some organizations still want you to email them your proposal. So this is an example of the Mazda Foundation, and their grant application process goes from May 1st through July 1st. So if you're looking at them, they're coming up here, their deadline's coming up. But anyway, you actually download the application form and then you email it to their website, or to their email address. So this actually shows you down here what the proposal will include. And I think, as I recall, that's a fairly short proposal process for Mazda as well. So anyway, there's a couple of examples. And actually I have one more sample here, an example of a mailed submittal. Believe it or not, some still have mailing submittals. So this is the Max and Victoria Dreyfus, and they have grants for $1,000 to $20,000 for a variety of funding categories, and they fund throughout the country. So it's pretty small, but I actually tried these guys a few times before finally getting a $5,000 grant over at St. Francis for a capital type grant we had a mobile unit that needed some upgrades that we got funding for. But this application process is actually more like a letter of inquiry, and you actually mail the hard copy, and they have their mailing address down here. And I think they have, they have 2 deadlines throughout the year. So that's an example of a mailed submittal. So next I'm going to go on to the letter of inquiry and the specific about particular grants. But before I do, just wanted to check to see if anyone had any questions on anything up to this point, or anything else, or Kevin, any questions in the chat box?
No questions in the chat box, but guys, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions. I know we're covering a lot of material.
Tim, I have a question. Maybe this is something you'll cover later, but is there a threshold that you get to, like you've applied to different foundations several times and you haven't gotten a grant? Is there a point where you stop submitting, or do you continue based on the needs, or do you stop spending valuable time on different foundations?
That's an excellent question. And no, that's not actually covered in the presentation. And with a lot of questions, it's actually depends. I hate to say that, but it depends on the situation. So for example, I just mentioned the Dreyfus Foundation. I tried 2 or 3 times, but that was a low level of effort. So I tried a few times. And so if it's a low level of effort, and it's maybe something that you don't have to tailor too much, I might try a few more times, try a different program. But also, so it also depends on if you're able to contact the funder. Sometimes, you're not able to contact a funder to get any ideas. But so for other examples, if it's a high level of effort, I may only try a couple of times. So we've talked about the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, for example. That's one I tried a couple of times when I was with St. Francis, and I finally gave up after 2 or 3 times we had what I thought was a really good fit, but we never got funded. So I was able to contact them finally, and so they preferably, Bank of America prefers to give to organizations where they have their employees volunteering with your organization, or they might have someone on your board. So they need some sort of connections there. So anyway, if it's a high level of effort, I'll have to try to have a really really good reason to apply to them, more than maybe twice, but you can kind of gauge it, once you might get fed up with someone if you give a lot of effort 2 or 3 times and you're not having any luck. If you can't you can't contact the funder for any feedback, then a lot of times it's just best to move on to something, a different target.
I have a question.
Does that help at all, by the way?
I have a question.
Yeah, it totally does. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, hi. So I have written responses to many RFPs in the past for, like, Ronald Reagan UCLA Center for whatever, changing all their physiological monitoring systems, or, to the Orange County Sanitation District, the city of Orange, San Diego Transit. When I look at their proposals, it's really different, I guess, in this type of industry, because we're not allowed to, like, even speak to the person that's putting the proposal together. You're not allowed to ask questions. If you have any, you can only email them. You can't really call them because it'll disqualify you from to be even considered to bid on a proposal or anything like to submit a proposal. But it's different, I guess, in the charitable aspect in this industry.
Yes, Maria, you are absolutely right. And actually, I did have something about that in my notes earlier that I skipped over. So yes, so with government funding, usually you can only contact them through, once the RFP comes out, you can only contact them through official channels. So you'll have to send in an email question to them, and usually there's a deadline date by when they accept questions, and then they will usually send out an email to all applicants, the answers to all the questions. So that way things are on an even basis for everyone. So they got to keep things fair. So Maria's right. So if you try to contact the funder separately, you do run the risk of getting disqualified. So it's different with, usually with foundation funders, if there's like, say, for example, a funder has a submittal that doesn't have a deadline, you can submit any time. You can contact them and talk about the proposal, what help on your proposal. So for example, UniHealth, they're really good at talking to you ahead of time about what your proposal should be like, or what you should submit for, helping you craft your proposal. Or California Community Foundation, they were also really good at talking to you ahead of time. There are some funders you just have to be careful about if they have deadlines. Some may not want to answer questions, but in general, foundations you can contact if they're willing to accept questions. Now, regarding government funders, sometimes you can find out about an RFP that's in the future. So say if you're, some government grant sites have grant forecasts, like say they're gonna have an RFP that's gonna come out next month. Well, you can actually call them and talk to them at that point about their RFP ahead of time, and anyone could call and talk to them and ask any questions. So that's actually a great thing to do. If you can get ahead of the game before the RFP, you can get great intelligence, like what they're looking for in this RFP, how much they're looking to spend. You can ask them about incumbents on the grants. Do they like the incumbents, or are they looking to fund new organizations? Something along those lines. So just be careful about government grant contacts. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, well, very good. So next we're going to start talking about the letter of inquiry and that type of thing. So the letter of inquiry, as I mentioned, some submittals start with a letter of inquiry. And so the goal of a letter of inquiry is to make the foundation want to learn more and to get and invite a full proposal to the letter of inquiry. There we go. So the letter of inquiry, usually 2 to 3 pages long, and it's a summary. It'll include like your organizational background. You want to include the amount requested, obviously, include a short project description, goals and objective of the project, who your partners are, and what you're going to do for evaluation and sustainability. So anyway, basically, it's kind of like a mini proposal, but it's summarized down very succinctly into 2 to 3 pages. So once you get invited to submit a full proposal, or you're going straight to a proposal, there's something called the 90% rule of grant writing. Now, I didn't make this up, but I've seen it in a couple of other presentations. So one of the reasons why we spent so much time on the process ahead of this time earlier is the 90% is what you're going to spend in the grant process. So understanding the guidelines and instruction requirements like we talked about, contacting the funder if you can, and developing a relationship, developing your concept, getting data, identifying any gaps in your information, and expanding the concept if needed, identifying the cost, developing the budget. All that's maybe about 90% of your time. 10% is actually spent writing and submitting the proposal. Now this is rough, roughly. A lot of these things up in the 90% portion, you'll be editing or revising during the writing process. But this gives you an idea of why we spent so much time on the first set of the slides, or the first half of the presentation. So wanted to talk in general a little bit about the hallmarks of a good proposal. A good proposal will get people excited and tug at their heartstrings. You've probably heard that before. Similar to any donor solicitation. You want to tug at their heartstrings. You want to tell a story as much as you can. You want to have clear and concise writing, and it's easy to read and say what you mean, because you want to make it as easy for the reader or the evaluator to understand your proposal and what you're trying to do. Obviously, you want to make it as free as grammatical errors as possible, and you want to make sure that you respond specifically to the questions. And this is where that checklist comes in that I mentioned earlier. You go through that checklist after you finish your draft, compare it, and make sure that you've hit on everything. Also, you want to make sure you follow the guidelines of the funder exactly. Make sure you follow not only the questions, make sure you follow all the formatting requirements and the page limits. And some of them nowadays are going to tell you that it's got to be a 11-point font in Arial or something like that, and it's got to only have 1-inch margins on each side. So you got to make sure that you get all those formatting issues down. And also you want to, I like to limit the use of acronyms. Personally, I hate acronyms, but I know that sometimes you're going to have to use them, especially on those online forums when you're limited by use of characters. So obviously sometimes you're going to have to use acronyms. But anyway, a lot of times they make it harder to read, especially if they're unfamiliar acronyms, or if you're making up acronyms. That we've done that sometimes, which I'm not a big fan of. Like, for example, St. Francis Medical Center, they always use the acronym SFMC. And I hated that. I would just why not just say St. Francis? It's not much more longer than SFMC. But if it was an online form where I had limited character space, then I'd go with the acronym. So getting back to the evaluator, you got to know your audience if you can, if it's a technical proposal, but you don't want to assume that your evaluator or the reader has the technical expertise, or don't assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. So you want to basically make it easier for them to read and spell everything out. And also regarding telling a story as much as you can, I wanted to give an example of a personal experience. Again, back when I was at St. Francis, we submitted to the California State's Victim Compensation Board for something called a trauma recovery center. And a trauma recovery center is something that provides services to crime victims. So give them mental health services, social services, wraparound services. And so this was a very important program for St. Francis to receive, because St. Francis, they're in Linwood, they have a very busy emergency department with, unfortunately, they get a lot of crime type victims in their emergency department and trauma center. So we really wanted this grant, and we'd actually had tried in the past and was not successful. But one way when we were finally successful, we decided at the beginning of our program narrative is to actually weave a little bit of the story of St. Francis and Linwood into our proposal. So we gave 3 examples of real life situations that had happened recently that were covered in the media. So it was only about a couple of sentences each, but there was unfortunately, a little girl that had gotten killed by random gang gunfire. There was vehicular assault, and there was also a stabbing. All of these 3 stories had been in the media, and the victims had actually been in the St. Francis Emergency Department. So we kind of weaved that in, and to show the importance of why St. Francis needed this program. And along with that, we included the crime statistics of the city and the area, as well as the statistics of the emergency department of how many crime victims they were seeing. So just that little bit really helped tell the story of the need for St. Francis and how we could help the crime victims in the area. So long story short, we got the grant that time. So let's move on to general proposal content. So wanted to mention that not all foundation proposals are alike, not all RFP or government RFPs are alike. In fact, most of them are all different, unfortunately. So what you could probably do right now is prepare these contents for your particular program, and you'll find a funder, and somehow there'll be something a little bit different. So every funder has their own circumstances. The page limits are different, the character limits are different, or sometimes these sections are called different things. And so excuse me. Anyway, typical proposal though will include a cover letter, an executive summary, your description, background of your organization, the needs statement, a project description, a budget and a budget narrative, evaluation section, section on sustainability, and appendices, various attachments and or forms that you need to fill out. So wanted to go over in general some of these aspects of a proposal. So the cover letter is usually only one page. You want to include the name of the proposed project, the amount requested, a brief organization and or project details, and it should demonstrate, you want to demonstrate your leadership's commitment to the project if you can, and you want to make sure you include contact information on who to contact with questions about this proposal, and it should be signed by the appropriate staff member or executive director or executive person. So usually, particularly on government grants on a cover letter, you're going to want to have the cover letter signed by someone with signing authority, someone who has authority to bind you into a contract. So like I mentioned, that's one thing you got to make sure that you build into your checklist, is make sure that you have the cover letter completed and signed, or cover letter completed on the CEO's desk in time for him to have enough time to sign it and get it back to you. So also in that letter, you want to show appreciation for their current relationship. Hopefully you have one, and thank them for previous support. So that's a lot that we talked about, but again, it's usually one page, and a lot of the times the funders will tell you what they want to see in the cover letter. So be sure, like we talked about, read the guidelines and see what they want to see specifically in a cover letter. So often the executive summary is either required, or sometimes if it's not required, I like to include one anyway, even if I have enough room, because the executive summary, that's a high level overview. It's usually just 1 or 2 paragraphs with a short summary of the project, the clear ask statement, and the purpose. So like I mentioned, that if it's not required, a lot of times it's good to include one also. So like I said, it focuses on the key elements, and it usually answers the questions for the funder. Does it make sense? Does it meet their needs? And has it been planned? And is your organization capable of this? So very brief, but high level overview. So some proposals ask for an executive summary. Some government proposals actually ask for a project abstract instead, and that's usually maybe 1 or 2 page summary of the project. So those are a couple of the options. So far we've talked about the cover letter and the executive summary. Can anyone tell me or suggest when in the process you might want to actually write your cover letter and executive summary, or project abstract for that matter? Any guesses or suggestions? Okay, well, I personally like to write the executive summary and the cover letter last, because often when we're writing these proposals, things change. So your executive summary, you want to make sure it summarizes your proposal. And if you write it at the beginning, you might have something incorrect in there. So anyway, a lot of times you can get the cover letter started maybe, but your cover letter in particular is going to include your ask amount. And sometimes your ask amount is going to change throughout your proposal process depending on a lot of things. So that's my recommendation. So next, we want to talk about the description. In the description of the organization section, your goal is to establish your organization as the right organization for the project. So you want to establish yourself, and things you might include in the description, when and why your organization was founded, your role in the community, the geographic scope of your services and who you serve, significant accomplishments of your organization, especially related to your current request, and maybe a summary or a list of your other core programs. So remember, this section is just about your organization. You don't want to describe the program or the problem in this section. Another thing, though, you might want to talk about in this section is the fiscal stability of your organization. So you can talk about your organization budget, maybe, or talk about briefly about some of your executives, your experience of your executives, or your commitment of your executives to the organization or the project in general. So quick description of the organization. So before I move on, next we're going to move on to the needs statement. But does anyone have any questions just in general about what we've talked about so far?
No questions in the chat box, but guys, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. No worries there. That's what this is for. If you don't have any questions, that's great too.
Okay, very good. No problem. Let's move on to the needs statement, which, did I hear a question? Okay. The needs statement, also sometimes called the statement of need or the problem statement. This tells the story about the population you are serving. So you want to be creative, but you want to exercise balance. So this section is, you want to tie the need to your population first and foremost. So you want to answer these questions in your needs statement, problem statement. What's the problem that you're facing? And then what's the desired state of things? What will happen if this need is not addressed? Why must this problem be addressed now? And what evidence you have to document this need. So your goal, you want to create urgency in the need statement, but not necessarily, you're not panic, but you're wanting to create urgency. So this is the problem that we're facing, and this is what we need to do about it. So the purpose is to convince the reviewer of the need, and you want to compel them to want to respond. It clarifies the importance and the urgency, like we mentioned, of solving this problem, gives them hope, and it shows that this will provide a solid base for building the rest of your proposal. So things to keep in mind, though, when you're doing your needs statement, you don't want to assume that everyone sees the problem as clearly as you see it. So you need to show them and demonstrate to them and convince them. So you need to ground your needs statement in fact and not in opinion here. You're stating the community needs, not your organization needs. So compelling needs statements will include facts, like we mentioned. So you want to include statistics whenever you can, and you want to have local and comparative statistics. So what I like to do a lot of the time is do the local statistics, maybe the city or your area, compared to the county and compared to the state. So you can show the differences, and however you can show best that your area has certain needs that you're needing to address. And so at the bottom here, I wanted to show you an example of an actual example of a table. This is what we include on that government proposal, the RFP I showed you earlier. This was the HRSA, but anyway, this was in our needs statement. It showed poverty, education, insurance, and food insecurity of the population that we were serving. This particular one, we actually got out of the St. Jude Center Community Health Needs Assessment. So this one, PSA stood for Primary Service Area, and SSA is Secondary Service Area, and TSA is Total Service Area. And then that we can compare what our service area was to Orange County. And so this is one way to do it, but you also can compare it to, like I said, state, even national, depending on your particular organization and the needs. So wanted to talk a little bit more about where to find this information if you don't already have it. So there are a number of sources. There's a source called the Orange County Community Indicators, the 2019 to 20 Orange County Community Indicators. That has a lot of good demographic information on it about Orange County, and you can find that for free online. And also, you'll want to likely learn how to look up and use census data. So there's through the census, they're online, and you can use data called the American Community Survey online, where you can go in there and search the database and get out information from countywide, statewide, nationwide, but you can also break it down to citywide or to census block wide. So there's a lot of different ways you can get that information. So how do you do that though? You're gonna probably wanna look around for webinars and education on how to use census data. So every now and then you can find a webinar on census data for grant makers. And I think the US Census actually has had one in the past. And as a matter of fact, right as we speak, the Grant Professional Organization, they're having a webinar on using census data. And so that's another way to find it. So anyway, look for census data and look for education on how to look it up and use it. I know that was kind of a quick overview, but are there any questions in particular about finding and using data? Okay, okay, good, thank you. The project description, now here's where you're gonna wanna describe your project, and you're gonna describe the activities that you will undertake to address the needs that you stated in your needs statement. So obviously you want to relate this section logically to the needs statement that we just discussed about. And including the activities, you're going to want to specifically mention how the funding will be used for your project. You're going to want to include timelines and milestones within there. And you know, as with the needs statement, you don't want to assume that your reader is familiar with your subject matter. So you want to be clear and descriptive in your writing and detailed. Use examples and data. And also another thing you want to use here is a good place to talk about your collaborative partners. So a lot of proposals, a lot of funders nowadays, they like to see you collaborating with another partner or partners. So this is the section you're going to talk about what partners you have involved and in what capacity. And this could be collaborators that are going to be receiving funding through the grant, or also non-paid volunteers, funders that are not paid, but they're part of the program in some aspect or another. So this is a detailed area to describe your project, your activities, your partners, and your timelines. So goals and objectives in your evaluation section. This is the benchmarks on which you will measure your project success. And so a lot of the times goals and objectives they're mixed up, they seem interchangeable, but goals are your broad statement of what you want to accomplish. They're broad and visionary. So, you know, we want to end hunger in the county or something like that. You know, we want everyone to learn how to swim or be educated on a certain topic. So that's your goal, your overall broad and visionary thing. But your objectives, you may have heard this acronym before. Your objectives is a SMART objective. It's your specific steps towards accomplishing that goal. So the objective is narrow, precise, tangible, and can be measured. As like we mentioned, that's the acronym, the SMART objective: specific, measurable, achievable, relative, and time bound. So that's one of the main things you want to make sure there. You want to have 2 or 3 objectives, but you want to make sure that they're something that you could achieve and relevant to the needs and the project. And you'll be able to track and measure those. So I wanted to talk briefly about, maybe give you some sample objectives. So does anyone want to suggest any sample objectives they use for their projects, or anyone have one recently that they wanted to share or talk about? Any examples?
This overarching objective or the like lower level objective, like what you want to accomplish with the money?
Yeah, either one that you would like to.
Sure. So my overall objective is to educate students and the community about ocean life and animals that live there and protecting them.
All right, so that would be your goal.
That would be our overarching goal. Mm-hmm.
Goal, right. And then, so some of the objectives you have specifically are?
Well, so we have programs that focus on different aspects for different grade levels.
Okay.
But like, I don't know where that would be for an objective. But maybe like the Boeing grant that we got, we were like, we to modernize this program, like removed a few programs, modernized the program, made it more relatable to renewable energy or what, water quality, whatever that core was.
Right. Okay. Well, good. So I have I have one sample here. This is kind of based on one of our recent projects, but like a sample objective, someone might say, we will reduce substance abuse by members of the community. Well, that could be an objective, but for the objectives that funders are looking for on proposals, this one's not really a SMART objective relating to that acronym. So the way that it actually showed on our proposal was more something along the lines of this. By December 31st, 2020, program staff will identify and enroll 12 new patients into the medicated assisted treatment program. So this just kind of gives you an example. You want to have a few objectives that you have the date on there. So by this date, we're going to do this many things. And so you could see that there's something that you can measure and count, and it's achievable and relatable specifically to your program. So does that kind of make sense a little bit there? Good. Okay. I want to spend a little bit of time on budgets and give you an idea about budgets. So budgets retell the story with numbers. So the budget will tell the funder whether you understand the resources needed to complete the goals and objectives, whether you've read these instructions clearly, whether your budget is realistic or inflated. And so you want to make sure, though, your budget is realistic, but don't restrict yourself when developing. And so in your project description, you're going to be talking about the different people in your project, your different staff members that are going to be working on the project, the different positions. So in the budget, you want to make sure you include all those staff members in the budget, as well as what's also called a budget narrative. So you'll have a line item budget, and most of the times you'll have a narrative to describe what's in that budget separately. That's called the budget narrative or budget justification. So in your budget, what you're going to want to do is develop your entire total budget. So what it's going to, the entire cost to run this program. And then you're also going to want to have another column that shows how much of that money you're requesting. Another column usually for other funding that's secured or pending, and also what other in-kind contributions you have. So these are some of the things that funders look like for. So in-kind, when we're talking about in-kind contributions, that's we're talking about volunteer time, equipment, or donated materials that your organization is either going to give to the project, work on the project without charging, or that you'll be able to receive in kind from other organizations. So all this is very important to include in the budget. So the line items in a budget will include salary for the personnel. So you want to include what type of, how high, what percentage they are at your organization, and how much percentage time that they're going to spend on the projects, as well as what the benefits are for those personnel that you normally usually need to break down the percentage of each of the benefits, on how much to healthcare, how much to insurance, that type of thing. You're going to want to include operating costs or supplies and materials that are going to be required for your project. And also you're going to need to, hopefully you can include indirect costs. And not all funders allow indirect costs, but indirect costs are something that's a cost of running your program. So, you know, your staff members have to have the lights on, you know, that type of thing. So indirect costs include maybe executive oversight, human resources, accounting, utilities, you know, IT or technology, those types of things that usually you can include in indirect costs. Sometimes funders will have a limit on how much you can ask for indirect costs, or for government programs, often they'll have, you need to get your indirect cost rate approved in advance, which is, you know, that's a whole nother webinar altogether. So, so like I mentioned, you'll have your budget table, but also the budget narrative, which the budget narrative clarifies and justifies all those expenses listed in your budget. So often you'll need to include funds for evaluation, data collection, that type of thing for some. So don't forget that in your budget. And another thing to think about if you're doing a multi-year budget for a multi-year grant, don't forget about increasing costs. So you want to have salary escalation for years 2 and 3 for your personnel. So you might want to budget in, let's say, a 3% raise in the budget for each year. Or if you think your supplies costs are going to increase, you might want to increase the costs in year 2 and year 3. So that's another thing to think about in the budget. So I have a couple of sample budgets to show you. And the first one, this is just kind of a made up budget, but it was based on an actual funder. So you can see in the table on the left here, you have, you know, your personnel expenses and what percentage FTE they're going to be on the project. Your benefits for those persons, that's, you know, it's this times 0.28. You're going to have whatever your direct expenses are going to be with your subtotal, and then your total expenses. So this particular budget didn't include indirect or evaluation or data collection, but that's other things to consider. But if you look at the different columns here, the first column in this particular example is how much you're requesting from the funder. And the second column is how much your organization is going to donate to the project. And then the third column is other sources. So say you've already got a grant from another organization. So that would go into this column. And then the final column, so your total budget. So for this particular program, you know, you're thinking the total costs are going to be at least 141,000, but you know, you may think that a funder can only fund maybe 82,000. So that's one sample budget. And if you could see this, I'm not sure, but this is a sample budget. This was actually from LA County from a few years ago, which I really liked, and I actually borrowed it on other projects for when I had to create my own budget template. But up here on salaries with the different staff members, then you have a column for their monthly salary. You have your percentage of time, like it'd be 1.0, 0.5, and then the number of months on the program. So this would be an Excel program. So you would type in your numbers in there, you know, and everything would automatically calculate. And you have part-time employee benefits, etc., and then your other sections down here, you know, including indirect costs and total program budget. So this would be, you know, something that you could borrow from or you know, use if you're so inclined. But anyway, that's one that I kind of liked, but you know, it's a total, and I adapted it to my own liking for other programs. Before we move on to sustainability, did we have any questions about the budgets or anything else we've covered so far? Okay, well, very good. So sustainability is often a tough question, but it's something that funders usually ask about. So sustainability describes how the project will be sustained after the funding runs out. So the funders want to be ensured that the program will be continued after their funding ends. So they'll often ask for a sustainability plan. And the tendency for us grant writers is to say, well, sustainability plan is easy. We're just going to, you know, apply for more grants, right? Well, funders don't really want to hear that. They want to hear your other plans for other than just applying for other grants. So some of the things to, when you're writing the sustainability section, you want to provide that funder with assurance, number one, that other funders are in the mix. So we kind of talked about this in the budget section, that you can show them that there's other funding that's secured, that's already been secured. You have pending requests, and you have a list of future submittals. So other grants can be part of your sustainability, but you need to have other strategies besides just grants. So I wanted to throw that out there to see if anyone had any ideas, if they or any examples or suggestions that they could think of, or maybe that they know about or have used on sustainability for other projects. So can anyone think of any examples of anything that might be effective at answering these questions?
For our programming, we do a certain amount that are funded through our grants and private donors. So when we go and talk about sustainability, we talk about being able to continue to fund them because we have paid programming. We have a margin of cost on the paid programming that helps us, allow us to, you know, if it's a student that can't pay or a, you know, school that can't pay, fund them.
Yes, exactly. That's a good element. And so similar on healthcare, you know, we've had some programs where we could say, well, in the future, it might be able to be sustained by being able to, you know, charge insurance for the, you know, bill insurance for the services or something like that, where we're starting a program that's not billable, but it might be in the future. So that's definitely one way to sustain it, or through other funding, other revenues, or revenues from the project or from the organization. Anything else any other suggestions from anybody else? Okay, so there's some other things that you might be able to include in a sustainability plan is, working with other organizations, or working with other programs in your organization. So there are various ways that you can address this question. And so I know on some in the past, what we've done is, we talked about, if we can't sustain it through grants, we can always wrap this program into one of our other existing programs, or, if unable to sustain the program with our own funding, our partner organization can sustain it with their organization. So partners, other programs that you have, revenues, those types of things, all part of the sustainability mix. And there's others that you could probably think of and find out there. Proposals may have various attachments or appendices that they require, and including a board roster. So you're going to want to have a roster handy of your board, and sometimes this will be, they'll want the board names, addresses, and contact numbers. Sometimes they'll just want the list of the board, of the board roster. You're going to make sure that you have your IRS determination letter handy and your tax ID number. Oftentimes, they're going to ask for your audited financial statements and or your Form 990s, sometimes multiple years. Often, they'll want to ask for your organizational budget in addition to your program budget. A lot of funders, they like to be sure that you're a strong organization and you're going to be able to have the financial footing to conduct this program, particularly if it's a reimbursement grants, whereas you bill in arrears for the services that you've conducted. A lot of times you're going to include resumes or bio sketches of your key staff. So you want to get those on hand, keep a library of those, have those handy of key staff at your organization. Often you'll need either letters of support from other organizations just saying, hey, we support this organization, we support this project, and or letters of commitment from your collaborative organizations saying that, yes, we commit to working with your organization to this, for this project. So letters are one thing that you're going to need to start to get started on fairly early in the process. A lot of the times what people do is they'll actually draft the letter for the organization or send out a template. And so that way, when you're asking your partner organization, they can tailor it, put their name and address in and date and sign it and get it back to you quickly. So that'll be also very appreciated from your collaborators as well. So also, more and more nowadays, funders are looking for organizational demographic data. And so data on your employees, your staff members, your board members, and your CEOs. So most of the times it's optional, but more and more funders nowadays are wanting to see demographic data. They want to make sure that they're have a diversity in their funding. And so that, like I mentioned a couple of times, there may be other forms that you need to fill out, particularly with government forms, with state and cities nowadays, counties. They seem to keep adding on different forms that that are required of all proposals. So you might need to work with someone in your organization to get those filled out properly and signed by the property authorities at your organization. So let's see here. So you got the submittal in, you looked through everything very carefully, you got a perfect submittal. After the submittal, you can breathe for a moment, but you want to prepare for any potential follow-up questions, or sometimes the funders will request a site visit from you. Regarding site visits, actually going back to, remember we talked about cultivation of your funders. When you actually do get a hold of your funders, that's one thing you want to ask in addition to the other question, your SMART questions, is ask them to come and visit your organization or visit your program. That's usually the best way to get them excited about your program. Or if they can't come to a visit, ask if they want to get together for a cup of coffee. A lot of times they won't be able to, they're too busy, but there are certain funders that are happy to come out or happy to meet with you. So just touching back on that cultivation again is getting to know those program managers and getting them interested in your programs. Those program managers at the funders, they're going to be your ambassador to shepherd your proposal through the process on their side, through their review process, and hopefully advocate for your proposal on their board. So another reason why cultivation is very important. So anyway, sometimes the funders will wait until after they receive the proposal to come and visit your site. So another thing after submittal, you want to consider what to do if you get an award or what to do if you get a denial. So I like to always anticipate an award. So you want to know your hiring process. If you don't have a separate grant manager that does all this, might fall upon you. If you're going to be hiring new people, if you get this funding, you might want to talk to HR ahead of time and say, hey, this is what's coming up. And, so I don't know about your organizations, but ones that I've worked with, the hiring process could take a couple of months. So if you have your funding starting on July 1st, you want to make sure you get, if you have to hire new staff, you get that person in place as soon as possible. You also want to know your grant contract review process. So do you have a risk management department that needs to review your contract before getting signed, or your contract or your grant agreement before your CEO signs it? So know that approval process. So once that grant agreement comes in, you can shepherd that through your process if needed. You might want to get together with your accounting to get that accounting process ready and let them know that this grant might be coming, and let them know once you have once it comes, you're going to want your program staff and others to get together for a kickoff meeting, and so you get that grant started right away and start using up that funding. Sometimes it happens, more than not, obviously, is you're going to get a decline. So what you want to do is try to contact the funder afterwards for feedback. And hopefully you've developed that relationship with your funder. You can talk to them and say, hey, was our proposal close or were we way off? And a lot of times they can give you feedback, let you know what the thinking from the reviewers were or their board members, and that will help you determine whether you want to resubmit that proposal with some tweaks, or if you're way off base and need to submit for a different program. So that's another reason why you need to keep in contact with your funders. Sometimes government funders will send you feedback automatically. So we've had a government grant where we were declined, but they sent us, it was a pretty detailed 3 or 4 page Word document that shows how we did on each question. So that way we can see where we fell short on some of the questions and where we can beef it up in the next go around. And had I'm not sure how Orange County does it yet, but over in LA County, you actually could meet with them in their offices and they would go over the proposal with you and actually show you the proposal notes. So very important to try to get feedback if you can.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you mentioned the importance of demographics for people served. And for the funders, have you seen an increase in interest for demographics of the people serving, the amount of women in the organization, stuff like that?
For the organization, well, what I've been seeing so far is that I think they're just asking for the information at this point. From, they want to know the race, ethnicity, and genders of sometimes of your staff, or sometimes just of your board or your CEO. So yes, I've been seeing that more and more.
Okay, thank you.
And talking about rejections, some of the reasons for rejections could be, the proposal didn't match the RFP, you didn't follow the guidelines, or it was poorly written or unclear. Those are some of the types of things that you might hear as far as reasons for declines. So hopefully you did get the grant, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about reporting. So once you do receive a grant, you'll need to report at certain intervals. So reporting provides an opportunity for you to reflect and also to generate a conversation to the funders. So here you provide the information on what you promised in the proposal, and all the times you want to make sure you get these reports in on time. So I always send myself an Outlook reminder of when the reports are due, and have the reminder come in, maybe 2 or 4 weeks ahead of time, so you can hopefully you're meeting regularly with your project manager at your staff who's running the project, so you can go over the program with them and see how they're doing, see how they're moving towards their deliverables and how they're doing on the budget. So that's something that all these things that you want to report. Usually it's at least a mid-year and an end-year report. Sometimes you'll have quarterly reports. But it's not just an opportunity to share good news, but you want to be honest and share your lessons learned and other issues. But I want to be stressed that you don't want to wait till a report is due to talk to the funder about a problem. So, let's say if you miss your goals, or you don't think you're gonna spend all your funding. Well, that's something you want to talk to your funder ahead of time. So the funders, they want to see your project succeed, because obviously they gave you the money. They want you to be successful. So keep in contact with them, not just at your reporting time, but whenever you need to, and they're there to help usually, and they'll work with you. So another reason to have a good relationship with your funder. Okay, I'm gonna go over talk about current grant trends, but before I do that, I was wondering if anyone had any questions on anything that we've gone over so far.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts. One time after a request for proposal and we submitted a proposal, they asked for revisions and it kept going on. They wanted changes and revisions to the proposal, and those took a lot of time and kind of, I think, got us off track a little bit.
Sure.
And then by the end, they came back with a denial. So I just wondered if there's a sense where if they're asking for things where it might be a waste of time, or how sincere do can you judge them to be when they're asking for?
Well, that's a good question also, and sometimes that will happen. They'll ask for revisions. Sometimes it might be if they don't, maybe they don't think the proposed program fits exactly with what their recommendations are, or maybe they'll just ask for more information and more details. That happens sometimes also, or they'll ask for more information about the board. Usually, I tend to think of that's a good thing, that maybe that they like the proposal, but they want to hear more, or maybe they like our organization. So that's another thing that's kind of on a case-by-case basis. So for an example, I had mentioned the Annenberg Foundation. I had received a proposal from them back at St. Francis several years ago. And I don't know how their proposal process is now, but that was a very lengthy proposal process back then. And in addition to the proposal, they came back several times and they wanted more information. They wanted a lot of specific information about our board and how our board operates. So we ended up spending a lot of time on that proposal and all the follow-up. And actually, I had the cultivation ahead of time. So for that particular program, I think we asked for $100,000 in the program. And we did get funded, but it only ended up being $35,000. And it was definitely helpful for the program, but it seemed like we probably spent more money trying to get the proposal than we actually received. So, it just kind of depends, I'd say, on a case-by-case basis. But generally, I want to do whatever I can to get the proposal. So I'm going to be, if I get a request for more information, I'm going to be as timely in response as I can. All right. Anything else?
I have one question.
Sure.
We had a number of grants that we, I guess, relied on year over year for many years. And because there's been such a shift in corporate philanthropy, especially for corporate foundations, in their giving and how much they're giving to a single organization and maybe spreading it around more, I guess, what do you suggest? How do you suggest approaching some of those foundations that have been such longtime supporters and grantors of some of our programs that just suddenly decline something that we've been receiving for like 5-10 years?
Right. Well, that's a good question also. And there are some funders that some funders will put that in their guidelines on the website, that they'll only fund you for a certain amount of years, or like you mentioned, sometimes funders want to spread the funding around more, give to different people. So what I would suggest is just need to have those conversations with the funder whenever you can. So maybe when you're getting, maybe right after you receive funding, maybe you can talk to them about, hey, ask them, are we good for next year? Or maybe it's like mid-year report time. You can talk to your funders. It's all about having a relationship with your funder, is trying to gauge them if they're going to continue funding you, or if if they're going to spread it around. So, like I mentioned, the Healthcare Foundation for Orange County, they've been a long-time funder for us, particularly St. Joseph Hospital. So, but they have a application period every year that's just a good reminder for me that I'm going to need to just want to check with them to make sure that they're still going to keep giving to the same funders, or if they want to spread it around a bit. So, yeah. All right. So let's go back here if there's any other questions. Share screen. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the current trends in grants. As you know, the world has turned upside down the past few months, and the grant world has been changing as well. So funders, both government funders and private funders, foundation funders, have poured a lot of money into COVID-19 funding, both for health organizations, but social service organizations. So that might be something that you guys want to go take a look at. So if you do some Google searches, there's a lot of information about that out there, particularly about some of the funding, the websites I talked about earlier. And also foundation funders, they're being pressured by others to give out more funding nowadays. And they're also being pressured to give out more unrestricted grants to help out with the issues that we're facing today. So, as we mentioned about that 5% requirement, people are trying to pressure funders to give more than 5%. They're telling these funders, if you really want to help, now is the time to spend more money. And also, some of the funders are loosening restrictions on current grants, and they're also loosening their reporting requirements. So the funders know that it's hard to do programs right now. Like for one of our hospital programs, the medicated assisted treatment, people are staying home. They're not coming into the program. So it's hard to conduct grant operations. So in response to that, funders are helping out the grantees. So if you have grants and you have a report coming up, or you're having issues spending the money, definitely contact your funders and talk to them about that if you haven't already. So these are some trends that hopefully we'll see continue, particularly the unrestricted grants. Like I mentioned earlier, that the general operating grants were few and far between, but hopefully now we'll be seeing more of those moving forward. So, and there was actually I've been reading several articles recently, but there was one very recent that you guys may have seen, that there are big funders like the Ford Foundation and some others. They're actually taking out loans to be able to spend more money right now. So a lot is happening at the moment. So just be aware of that. And let's go to some final thoughts on the grant process. So for grants, the grant process and submittals, like we talked about, don't apply unless you meet those eligibility requirements. And don't recycle proposals to different funders unless you tailor them to those specific guidelines for the different funders. Make sure you don't exceed the page limits and follow all the guidelines. If all the essential information you want in the actual proposal, don't put them in attachments, or don't exclude information without a good explanation. Try not to rely on the passive voice. I prefer the active voice. That's up to you, but whichever you choose, stick with one or the other. And don't assume that reviewers understand your project without a full explanation. But do write with the funder in mind. Edit those that you likely will have several drafts. Review that RFP to make sure you answered all the questions and met all those formatting requirements. And now, with that said, you don't want any grammatical errors, but there's an old saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We all want to try to be perfect, but just be aware of that also. I want to stress, make sure you allow time for communications with your staff and review of your drafts. So You also want to make sure your proposal, you might need to get your executive, your ED, or your CEO. You might need to get review and approval by them. So make sure you allow time for appropriate reviews. And if you claim it in the proposal, make sure you prove it with backup. And with that, I would like to ask for any other questions. That is the end of my presentation. And Kevin, do we have any time for any other questions?
Yeah, we do. We have about 5 minutes. So I know that was a lot of material. And like Tim said, it's recorded. So you probably want to go back and sift through, and we can certainly get you that information as well as the slides. But yeah, while we have Tim here, is there any follow-up questions or notes you took or things that you might need clarity on from what he covered?
Tim, how do you track your grants received? Do you track it in Razor's Edge too, or do you have a different program?
Well, both. We do track them in Razor's Edge, and then we have just an Excel spreadsheet that we have that's a planning spreadsheet that we list all of our grant opportunities planned and received. So we kind of have both.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I mean, technically, we should be able to do it strictly through Razor's Edge, but it's kind of easier right now to use Excel spreadsheets.
Gotcha. Thanks.
I don't know if you have any experience in this, but I've considered hiring a grant writer specifically just, because we don't have the capacity within. Any tips on how to hire a good grant writer and what you should expect to pay for one?
Yeah, that's a good question. And while I was at St. Francis, we used a contract grant writer. And it was someone who had actually been on contract with us even from before I started. But we had a contract, and it was we renewed every year. And I think at that time it might have been in the range of maybe $100 per hour. But the contract was a not to exceed for the year. So yes, I highly recommend contract grant writers. If you don't have the budget for grant writers on staff, it's a good way to go. And where to find good grant writers? That's a good question, and that's, I would think, either through recommendations from fundraising colleagues or through the networking opportunities that we talked about. I know for AFP, they do have at least some people who are contract grant writers. And so there's different ways to find them. And, what you could do, sometimes organizations will have multiple grant writers on staff. And so maybe some have expertise in a certain area, so they can use ones for certain programs or certain other programs. But grant writers good ones can be helpful because they help with you with the writing, but good ones will also help you with the research as well and finding opportunities. Definitely.
Any other questions?
One thing I just wanted to mention also, I know I talked a lot about budgets. Sometimes the grant writer prepares the budget. Sometimes, you have an accounting person that works on it for you. But one thing I wanted to also stress is that if you do prepare a budget yourself, make sure that you have someone that can review it for you prior to submittal. I always have someone review my Excel spreadsheets, make sure that the formulas are all correct, because that's the last thing you want to do is submit something with the incorrect formula and get the wrong amount of funding. And it has happened. So just another tip to look out for.